Welcome to webinar number 3 of Rising Together, Women for a Just Economy. And before we get into the program, I just want to turn it over to our moderator, Sheetal, Lodhia, to just familiarize everyone with the setup.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again to Rising Together, Women for a Just Economy. Bienvenue tout le monde à Agir Ensemble, les femmes pour une économie juste. This is our third installation of the webinar. Ça c'est notre troisième édition de webinar. And I mean, we're all at this point, as a side effect of the pandemic, experts in Zoom. But just in case we are not, let me reiterate what's happening at the bottom of your screen for our technological needs. So please note that you are all muted. If you are not a panelist, note that you are muted. Second, you'll notice that there's a whole host of icons at the bottom of your screen, emoticons rather. There's a chat button for communicating with one another and for sharing links. We will also be posting links and moderating the chat group. Please feel free also to ask questions of the speakers as we continue throughout the night. And I'll do my best to group the questions into themes and then pitch them to each of our speakers. There is also a little globe button that says interpretation, bottom right of the screen. And so you can please choose your language of preference for the presentations. We have live translation in English and French. And finally, there is a closed captioning button for closed captioning. Je vais répéter en français pour tout le monde. Veuillez noter qu'on a quelque chose de technologique à juste présenter en premier. En bas de votre écran, il y a quelques onglets avec des emoticons. Alors, il y a un pour le chat. Ça, c'est pour communiquer un avec l'autre. Vous pouvez discuter là. Et vous pouvez aussi partager des liens ou de l'information à tout le monde. C'est là aussi où vous pourriez demander des questions aux panélistes. S'il vous plaît, veuillez écrire dans votre langue préférée. De préférence, désolé. Il y a aussi un petit globe en bas. Ça, c'est l'onglet pour la traduction en direct. On a le anglais ou français. Et finalement, on a un petit CC. Ça, c'est pour le sous-titrage codé. And before handing over the mic, let me just thank our translators, Piotr and Angela, and our closed captioning person, Sydney Lang, who is an articling student at Cowessess. So I now turn it back to Jan and Faye, our hosts.
Oh, thanks very much, Sheetal. So what we wanted to do as we're opening today's Rising Together webinar is that we wanted to start with a settler acknowledgement of our obligations to work towards truth and reconciliation, both personally and collectively. So we're holding this webinar across all of Turtle Island. I'm the daughter of a second-generation white settler and a first-generation Polish settlers. Their immigration was driven by poverty in their homeland, and they became workers on this land that we know as Turtle Island. I commit to my obligations as a settler to continue to learn and to take action for justice for Indigenous peoples. And Faye?
My family is Indigenous to the Philippines, but we're displaced by colonialism and racism and have been given shelter here in Turtle Island. And I commit to my obligations as a first-generation settler here on Turtle Island to engage in learning and unlearning and positive action to building better relations. Mm-hmm.
So thanks, Faye. And as we start our session this evening, we're asking all of us as settlers to think about how each of us may take concrete steps and action towards a full recognition of all Indigenous peoples, Indigenous lands, and the structures in our society that are continuing to oppress Indigenous peoples and their lands. Our settlers before us failed to respect and acknowledge Indigenous peoples, practices, laws, and ways of knowing. Settlers approached their relationship with First Peoples as one of cultural genocide. This failure to respect and to acknowledge continues today. Settlers failed to abide by signed treaties and agreements with First Peoples. And these failures to abide by these treaties and agreements signed in good faith by Indigenous peoples continue today. So as one small act towards learning the truth of these lands, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional and unceded territories of many nations. We honor the First Peoples that have lived on Turtle Island for thousands of years. And we acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous persons in the area for time immemorial. This now urbanized area of what settlers call Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Metis peoples. This land includes Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Ojibwe Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Agreement and the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we'd just like to conclude by saying that we ask all participants on this webinar to reflect for a moment. Please think about your role as an individual in your organizations and what steps, concrete steps, you can take to fully recognize Indigenous peoples. And may this Rising Together webinar series just be one small piece of that journey towards reconciliation. And over to Faye.
So, welcome. I am just going to share my screen very briefly here. There. That's always more complicated than it should be, but here we are. So welcome to the third webinar in this series. We will have a total of 9 webinars over the course of the fall, and I'll set that out in more detail later towards the end of the webinar. But today's webinar is focusing on decolonizing the economy. And one of the places that we're going to start is by challenging that entire frame as a way of thinking about the problem. But I want to give folks who are new to this series an understanding of what the arc of our learning together is. For a number of years, the Equal Pay Coalition has been working with CREA, with the support of the Atkinson Foundation and the Canadian Women's Foundation, and thanks to CUPE for the assistance with ensuring these webinars are bilingual. We've been working over the past couple of years to build a cross-movement forum for solidarity and growing knowledge and growing opportunities to collaborate as we look at the deep roots of what continues to cause economic and social inequality for women in their full diversity. We had originally planned to have a big convergence of over 250 groups this spring, but that unfortunately was derailed because of the pandemic. And so we have reconstituted our gatherings and our conversations online. And this is the third in the series, where we have been so far in July. After 4 months into the pandemic, we together took stock of where everybody's communities were at, what were the challenges that people were facing, what were the deep fractures in our relations in our society that had been exposed, and what were the priorities that people had in needing to build their own security in their communities and personally. In August, we had our second webinar focused on the care economy, which we interpreted very broadly to encompass all the different ways in society and the different sectors in society where we give each other mutual support, whether it's through long-term care, childcare, midwifery, and all the other areas where we recognize our interdependence and need for mutual support. Our focus was on trying to think of how to shift the way we think about the economy so that that ethic of care and mutual support and interdependence is at the center of it. We were probing a number of ideas for how to think about truly building back from the pandemic in a way that addresses those roots of the structures that divide us. And so moving from the immediacy of the pandemic, our next set of webinars are looking at some of those very deep structures that continue to divide us. And colonialism is the foundation of all of that in our society here. All of the structures, the ways of interacting, the ways of knowing each other have been filtered and shaped through lenses of colonialism and domination, as opposed to that mutual support and interdependence. And so we want to start here with a conversation of to help us unlearn what we have learned that harms us, and to begin to learn better how to build relations. That is our hope for this webinar. As we've gone through all of the webinars, we want to make sure that we're not having easy conversations. All of these issues are difficult and challenging, and I think that it's necessary for us to acknowledge how complex they are. And it's in that spirit of making things three-dimensional and seeing the issues in their fullness that we open this conversation. So with that, I'd like to there was actually one last slide I wanted to show you, but that's okay. I was going to show you a picture of all of our wonderful panelists who we have today, but you are going to get to see them as they speak, and Sheetal will introduce them to you. So thank you so much, and Sheetal, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Faye, and thanks, Jan. So this is how we'll go for tonight. I'm going to introduce each speaker. I'll read a bio and then introduce that speaker and give them each the first topic to discuss. And that is, the very title of this webinar series, which is Decolonizing the Economy. And decolonizing these days is a framework that is used, everywhere. It's ubiquitous at this point. I've seen it in academia. I've seen it in the nonprofit sector. I've seen it everywhere. And so we can talk about why that term is problematic and the ways in which it's been contested. Let me start with our first speaker, Lindsay Kretschmer. Lindsay Kretschmer's family comes from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. She is German and Mohawk, Wolf Clan, and her spirit name is Swooping Hawk. Lindsay has worked in the nonprofit sector for nearly 20 years. She has served in senior management roles both locally and provincially for OAHAS, OFIFC, and NCFST. And she started her community service work as a volunteer at Council Fire Native Cultural Center 19 years ago. Her areas of expertise include Indigenous social justice issues and well-being, provincial and federal negotiations, program and training development, research and evaluation, policy and advocacy, and capacity and partnership building. So I now turn to you, Lindsay.
Hello, Sego. Good evening, everyone. I believe you were structured such that you wanted to start with asking me a question, or are you going to go through the bios first?
No, the question is that to you. Let's talk about the very title of this. Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll introduce each of you before you speak, so that way we don't have just me reading 10 bios or 4 bios.
Sure.
So Lindsay, please go ahead and tell us why you think, or how you think we can discuss this framework differently or better, the idea of decolonizing the economy, or decolonizing anything.
Yeah, I think decolonizing it's a fairly loaded term that lands differently depending on who it's landing for. I'm not a big fan of rhetoric or language that doesn't hold purpose, intent, or meaning. And so when I hear the word decolonizing, you know, some might say it's to disrupt, dismantle the current systems of oppression so that we can rebuild better ones for future generations. I question, what is it that we need to change as humans to build a better system, and how far are we actually willing to go to do that? I mean, to me, decolonizing can also mean that we no longer support policies that were created and enacted, you know, 100 years ago that don't really have a place in, you know, 2020. But more importantly, it really takes me to a place of a teaching that I received from Elder Yvonne Thomas, who's from my family's home community. Yvonne is Seneca Snipe Clan. She works for the Jake Thomas Learning Center. She was a very close personal friend of my family's. And I remember sitting with her once and asking her a question. I was in a role that required us to interact quite a bit with mainstream healthcare folks. And I had asked her advice on how to handle a question I was given. They said, how can we take Indigenous ways and Western ways and kind of meld them together? And I thought it was a peculiar question, and I didn't feel well prepared to answer that based on what I already knew and understood. And so I sat with her on it, and what she shared with me was a teaching on the Gaswenta, also known as the Turo Wampum. And so when you ask what decolonizing means to me, it means returning to those original agreements. And for those of you that can see the video, you'll be able to see that I'm holding a replica, also made by Yvonne, in fact, of a Turo Wampum, also known as a Gaswenta. This is one of you know, history's treaties here, and it speaks to a relationship between the Dutch settlers and the Haudenosaunee people. And the concept behind this is that both of us as a people, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, would be traveling through the river of life in our own respective vessels based on a principle of non-interference. And so you have this purple row here representing the river of life, for which Indigenous people are traveling in their canoe with their ways of knowing, being, seeing, and doing. And parallel and equal to, you have the settlers who are traveling in their ships with their ways of knowing, seeing, being, and doing. And we're traveling side by side, equal to one another, but never interfering in one another's ways. The 3 white rows of this wampum represent peace, friendship, and respect. Now, these founding sort of principles for which we were meant to operate, we know, of course, in the context of North America, Turtle Island, that's not how things unfolded for us. And so when I think about decolonizing, I think about returning to a place and a state of sort of nation-to-nation relationship by which we respect that we have other ways of doing things. You know, to decolonize something is to recognize that there is more than just the colonial constructs by which we've been conditioned to abide by and adhere to. To decolonize means to actually change something. And change, when I think of change, is at a systems level, and systems are built by people. And until people change, those systems that we are, you know,
Thank you. Thanks so much, Lindsay. I'll now introduce our next speaker, Tamzin Fitzgerald. Tamzin Fitzgerald is a senior policy analyst and settler working with Women of the Métis Nation, a national advocacy organization representing the voices of Métis women across the homeland. Working on a range of policy files, Tamzin's main focus is gender-based analysis of and gender-based violence against Métis women. Tamzin also co-founded and currently manages Defend Choice, a pro-choice organization in the Capital Region that advocated for the injunction zone legislation in Ontario in 2017. She regularly engages in both provincial and national discussions related to reproductive rights and access. In addition to her MPM, Tamzin also holds a BAH from Queen's University in Gender Studies. So Tamzin, I turn to you and ask you the same question, which is about the topic we're discussing today. How do you frame decolonizing the economy? Do you contest that term?
I think it's a really interesting conversation, and definitely one that we need to have. So I'm happy that we are beginning this conversation today this way. At Les Femmes Michifo de Pemsuak, we really do prioritize strength-based approaches and narratives to all of the work that we do. The alternative to that is deficit-based narrative. So, you know, all too often when you're talking about Indigenous people, Indigenous issues, particularly Indigenous women, you'll hear words like victims, at risk, vulnerable, in need, lack of, really negative terms. And while this may be true when it comes to funding, it's really important that when we're having these conversations, we're also talking about the strengths and the contributions, both historic and contemporary, of Métis women, of all Indigenous women, and gender diverse and two-spirit folks. So that's the approach that we look at and that we do all of our work in. And throughout our engagement sessions, we've heard two main themes that come up time and again, no matter the policy discussion or topic that we're discussing. And that's both the rich history of Métis women in having built the Métis Nation, as well as their equal role in developing their communities through political and social and economic means. So when we talk about decolonizing, I think it's incredibly important that we acknowledge Indigenous resilience that has always been there. You know, approximately 50% of the elected leadership of the provincial Métis organizations are women. Women are often the community leaders. So women are out there, they're doing the groundwork, they always have been. And so when we talk about decolonize, I think we often forget that fact, and we forget about the contributions that we're making, and the savior narrative kind of takes the place of that. So that's the approach that we have. And you know, the term decolonize really does center on the settler experience, and it kind of makes the norm you know, what happened during colonization, when the truth is Indigenous worldviews existed since time immemorial. And in the case of Métis women, they held very highly esteemed roles in their communities, you know, before European norms took root in media, in communities, in policy and legislation. So it's a conversation that balances co-development with being Indigenous-led, and really looking at the importance of being distinction-based as well too, because decolonize is kind of a pan-Indigenous approach that really paints all with the same brush, when that's not true. There's three unique Indigenous groups here in Canada. We have the Inuit, First Nations, and Métis Nation. And so to use the term decolonize is similar to using the term, you know, a pan-Indigenous. The truth is they're all very unique, and not even just in their nations, but even down to the individual level. You know, a Mi'kmaq woman living in the East Coast has a very different life compared to an Inuit woman in Inuit Nunangat, or a Métis woman living in British Columbia. So that's the approach that we try to take with all of our work in our engagement sessions, and that's continually what we've heard from the women and the two-spirit and gender diverse folks that we strive to represent.
Thank you so much, Tamzin. I'll now turn to our third speaker, Dodie Ferguson. Dodie is a proud member of the Cowessess First Nation Treaty 4 territory, and is proud that she grew up on her nation in a multi-generational farming ranching family. She's a proud postal worker with a focus on worker education. Through her work in labor, Dodie is assisting her fellow workers in assessing an alternate view of the impact of colonialism and on capitalism on Indigenous people, both in Canada and beyond. When she is not representing at executive tables in labor or in the classrooms of labor, Dodie recharges her spirit by spending time with her family and on the land. Dodie, I turn to you now on the topic of decolonizing.
Okay, well, thank you first for inviting me here, and thank you for everyone for taking some time out of their own personal schedules to be here with us tonight. Now, decolonizing the economy, I agree with the first two ladies. It is a very encompassing umbrella statement, and that's one thing that I think I have heard over and over again from Indigenous people, whether they identify as a First Nations woman or a Nehiyawisqueo, like I would, a Cree woman, or Métis, or non-status or status, all these different distinct silos that we were put in. I think the one thing that we all agree upon is that that broad brush that was mentioned earlier, it doesn't do justice to any of us in this relationship going forward in this country. From a Plains perspective, I would say that decolonizing the economy would look something like, where is I have right in front of me, would look something like this. And this is something that's available to anyone out there. It's an independent magazine that's published here in Regina, Saskatchewan, the Land Back issue. And I think land back, when I think about decolonizing the economy, I think about this term land back. And so what does that mean, right? It doesn't mean in a colonial context that we want land back and that solves everything. No. Land back means that we need to regain our connection on the prairies here, in Cree in particular. The nation that I'm from is Cree, and it's Soto, which OG Cree. It means not only having access to land, but learning to understand our relationship and reawaken, reinvigorate that relationship we had with land. We use the term Turtle Island an awful lot in our conversations, and it's one that's adopted across the country when we're talking about this land in North America. On the prairies here, land back, our relationship is one of a kinship with the land. We really didn't have it in the past a term for the land. It lived in relation with us. It fed us, it nurtured us. We learned to understand its own cycles and the cycles of all the other beings that lived on it. We don't do that in a capitalist and neoliberal environment. You go to any Indigenous land, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in South America, whether it's in the Philippines, whether it's in Australia, or even Ireland or Scotland, we don't look at our environment as an asset. And when you're talking about the economy, we're talking about a world of assets and liabilities. So it's really, for me, fundamentally, it's a bad term to try to encapsulate what we're trying to talk about, I think. This is a language lesson that we're having to go through over time. This isn't something that we've learned in school. We didn't grow up as Canadian society understanding the Indigenous context around us. And that context changes no matter where you live, right? Because Indigenous people, we have our own unique cultures, we have our own unique languages, our laws, our ways of being in different parts of what is Canada today, contemporary Canada. And I think I'm going to go back to your first webinar you had. Dr. Palmater said that there is no land base when she talked about the disparities that we have as Indigenous people, and the fact that we have been assimilated into society through systemic policies and systemic racism. That removal of the land removed a very critical relationship for us that had it doesn't have a monetary value. So when you're talking about decolonizing the economy, part of that conversation needs to also include putting value to those relationships that don't have any value in an asset world that is capitalism. And the reason why we need to do this is because as Indigenous people, we're becoming more aware of the awakening of our blood memories. And for those that don't know what blood memory is, it is the knowledge that we believe and we know is handed down to us through our grandmother's memory, to our mother's memory, to my memory, through just the fact that we exist, you know? When I hear someone speak Nehiyaw, when I hear them speak Cree, I may not know the full context of what they're saying because I did not grow up in a very fluid Cree world, but I understand the gist of what they're saying. When I hear the drum beat in ceremony, it isn't just music, it's a resonation within me. How do you put a monetary value to that sort of thing, to something that didn't have value in European colonial structure? So when we talk about decolonizing the economy, we have to talk about what we're valuing. We need to remove contrary policies like the Indian Act, because there's no room for us in this ongoing patriarchy that is systemic policy racism, up to and including the First Nations Land Management Act, which was the federal government's response to the cries for self-government and self-determination by First Nations people. But what they don't tell you about in the conversion of land management and asset management from the queen, the great white mother, the queen, the crown, what they don't tell you about in that transfer of power is that there's always fine writing, right? You know, a lot of us are in a labor background, and we all know it's all about the language of a contract. And when we transfer, when the federal government transfers that power to a nation, they actually have a little clause in there, a little article that says that we as a nation, once we sign that paper, cannot go back and change things if we feel like our rights are being impinged upon. We can't question it, because in this capitalist world that we live in, that we're forced to govern ourselves in, there are no financial assets to question and challenge in courts. A perfect example on the prairies here is in northern Alberta. There is actually a nation that has been fighting for water reclamation and repair and remedy from resource extraction, so they can live. You know, they don't have basic access to water, and what water they do have has been damaged by industry. And they've been fighting this battle in court for years, and they're out of money. So now what this nation is doing in particular, which I find very fascinating, is that they're actually taking the federal government to court saying, you're the ones that made this agreement, you're the ones that have left us with this, now you guys help us clean up the mess because you left us holding the bag. I am waiting to see what will happen in that case, because that case will have repercussions for the government, and that pebble that was thrown in that lake, the ripples, will be such a positive effect to other nations who have economic challenges and can't fight those larger battles in the colonial court systems. So when we're talking about decolonizing the economy, we're going to have to talk about decolonizing the structures and systems that support that economy. And in this capitalist environment that we're living in, that has a very, you know, right-wing swinging, you know, door right now, those conversations aren't well received, right? The other thing we have to talk about is this term decolonization, and I agree, again, it's an umbrella statement. As an Indigenous woman, I don't feel like I need to decolonize myself. Yes, I said it, I don't need to decolonize myself. But what I need is I need the time and the space to reclaim who I am and frame what I think is my contemporary nationhood. And we have to give other Indigenous people the free right and privilege and space to do that as well. We can't expect, as a Canadian economic structure, that Indigenous people are going to be more than ready and willing and prepared and able and equipped to go ahead and make these changes and ask for what they need to ask for. It's only the Truth and Reconciliation final report was presented at the House of Commons in Parliament in 2015. So it's been 4 years. That is not enough time to ask these questions, because our nations and our people are still in the process of healing from all the past wrongs. I'm in Treaty 4 territory, and our treaty was signed in 1874. So 146 years, I do believe, is what I calculated the other day. 146 years of oppression, of systemic racism, systemic policies, the past system, which was in effect here on the prairies till the 1960, my dad was 8. No, 8 before his dad had the right to vote. So all these things that I'm talking about, and day school, which I am a day school student, I'm waiting for my claim as well, like many others. My parents were residential school students, my grandparents were residential school students. So all of these years of trying to take the Indian out of the child cannot be remedied and repaired in the 4 years since the TRC final report. That just isn't going to happen. And I think that when we're talking about decolonizing the economy, we have to talk about giving Indigenous groups and communities the space and time they need to frame what it is they actually feel will benefit them and their communities and their people and the future generations. We have to talk about how colonization has changed our relationships. And I say relationships in a broad context. I'm going to speak again from a Nehi Awasqueyo point of view. I'm a grandmother, so I'm in that evolution. I'll talk about that more going forward. But I'm at this place in my life where I am more than ready, willing, and able to not only ask you politely for space, but if you don't move aside to give me space, I will claim it. And I see that happening more so with our children as they're regaining their spirit and their privilege and their right and their power. But back to our relationships, we need to think about the varied relationships that happen in Canada. I'm Indigenous, I'm a First Nations member. I have to think about the relationships on my reserve. I have to think about, in terms of economic wisdom, economic support, economic preparedness, I have to think about how our governance structure is developing. Because like I said, we're still reclaiming who we are and redefining who we are going forward. The one thing I think I have to say quite assuredly is we cannot unring the colonial bell. Once that bell rung and that gong sounded and resonated through history, we can't go back to what we were. And we have to recognize and acknowledge that has changed our governance systems. It's changed how we look at our child care and our elder care in our communities to a colonial structure where those two specific segments and demographics within our communities were very revered and very loved and very much nurtured because they were the beginning and the end of our cycle on this world. We have to talk about how the Indian Act chief and council system dismantled and fragmented our hierarchical structures, our inherent structures, our matrilineal power. Dr. Palmater talked a lot about matrilineal power in her first webinar in the series. And I have to agree with her because oral history has told us in Treaty 4 territory that when the signing of the treaty actually occurred near what is presently Fort Capel, Saskatchewan, when that treaty signing was happening, the Indian agents were confused as to why it was taking so long and why Indigenous men weren't so quick to make agreements and alliances and put language down. Why they would have to go back to their fires at night, and they just assumed that they were having conversations amongst themselves. What they finally realized and what somebody told them was those men were going back and having conversations with the women's groups, with the women's circles, asking them what, the Great White Mother is offering this. What do we ask for in exchange? Like, we're not sure. We're men. We can't make this decision without you, the women. The women said, well, we need access to make sure our children are healthy. When these guys come along, they're going to take land and they're going to take all of our traditional harvesting places for our medicines. We need their medicine. We can't talk to them. Our children aren't going to have to be able to talk to them. They're going to have to get some sort of education. When the Indian agents realized that these men were going back and consulting with women in the late 1800s, that was not received at all. That was rejected. And what they said is, finally, when they realized this, they said, listen, guys, enough of this. We've been negotiating for X amount of days. We're going to give you 4 more, and then you're signing on the dotted line, or we're moving on, and we're just going to take things. So since the beginning of this treaty relationship, women's roles has always been marginalized. It's always been shuttled to the side, and it's always been tucked under the blanket, for lack of a better term. So we need to think about those matriarchal roles. And when you live off reserve like I do, I live in Regina, Saskatchewan. I live about an hour and a half away from my nation. I have to think about all those things as well. The other thing that we have to think about is access to that land. Once Indigenous people get it, and once they have access to their traditional lands, how does that change their idea of economic wealth? What does that change? We also have to look at things like wages. If you were to work on reserve right now, there is a distinct difference in what a long-term care aide would be paid on the reserve versus what they're paid off the reserve. I have friends that work 20 minutes off their nation in a small rural community in the Pioneer Village nursing home for seniors that get paid a few more dollars an hour than their peers on the reserve who work with their elders. Why? Because the colonial structure has told Indigenous people that their communities and their work is valued less. So we have to look at how we value things. We have to look at education and how we allow, how we are given access or how we demand access to education to make us more savvy in terms of this capitalist and this neoliberal economic system that we're stuck living in. We have to demand as Indigenous people the valuation of women's roles in this economic structure. In terms of our traditional roles in the house, in the household, or in the community, or in our governance structures, and our contemporary roles. You look at our roles today in society, by and large, Indigenous women will automatically go towards roles where we're teaching people, like me, for example, and my mother, for example. We'll go to roles looking after children in social services, or being a social services worker. You look into roles in addictions and mental well-being, not because of any sexist pigeonhole that we're sliding into, but because we know we have to heal our people first from all the harms that have gone on. And if you look at any economic structure, if you look at any government today in Canada, there are very few that aren't slashing and burning childcare, education, healthcare. So we need to look at all of that if we're looking at Indigenous decolonizing our economy and putting proper value to these roles that play a very crucial gap in making sure that we have healthy, well-rounded citizens. And the other place we need to look at how colonization has changed our relationship is our relationship with the environment by and large. Take just a few minutes and you'll realize that under capitalism, there is no value to leaving Mother Nature the way she is. There's no value to it unless it's a resource that can be extracted, and then it becomes an asset. And then when you talk about the economy, there's no ability to make resource extraction and the value of the medicines above it on top of the ground, how to make that work, collaboratively. I have many friends that have worked or do work as Indigenous cultural consultants for big industry here on the prairies. In that you can read CPC and rail, you can read pipelines, you can read mining. None of them can say they have a positive and open and equitable relationship with their employer. Not a single one. And by and large, most of those people that have worked in that field have left because they're seeing that when they report something as being culturally sensitive, for example, say some industry wants to put something through a particular tract of land, they send in that cultural assessment officer. The assessment officer sees evidence potentially of burial mounds. I've had friends that work in industry tell me that the minute they've reported that verbally to a supervisor, gone back to their office, because these are far sites removed from offices, of course, their nature, go back to their office that night, prepare the report, send it off to head office, which may be international, it may be in Ontario, but the minute that report is sent, they feel they've done their job, they go back 2 days later to the same site, and the place has been bulldozed. Why? Because the person that was in charge of the bulldozers had a 2 or 3 day gap in talking with somebody from head office. So of course, it's always that whole idea of seeking forgiveness later. When you harm someone to that extent, you're harming them spiritually as well. You can't expect workers to go on in that kind of field and feel like their well-being is being cared for and that their voice matters. So when we talk about decolonizing the economy, we're going to have to take a hard look at how we value the environment and whether or not we respect the Indigenous perspective when it comes to environments. And I'm sure that Delee will go into this a little more when she talks about this. Now, I am an executive officer in my union. I have been on our National Human Rights Committee. I am a facilitator for the Labour College of Canada. I'm also a community facilitator for a lot of other organizations, and in particular about the environment. What I find when we talk about decolonizing something, there's a lot of openness and willingness to get us there as Indigenous women, to get us to the table. Fundamentally, our organizations have a philosophy in labor that they want to include us, that we have the right to have a voice, and that they'll give us their privilege, and that's wonderful. But the one thing that I always have to prepare myself for is the sexism that I'm going to face at that table. So when we talk about decolonizing the economy, we have to look at how the economy values women, period. They don't. We have to look at, I have to be prepared for racism, because even though the organization itself is prepared for me to be there and wants me there and wants to include my voice, I told the presenters yesterday, I always say that in theory, we want to include people. That's what society is moving towards. Since 2015 in the TRC, we're seeing this sexy talk of decolonization and revitalization. But we still are too people-y at the table. People bring their biases, they bring their personal opinions. And even though the organizations they work for may have a fundamental philosophy of inclusivity, the people themselves often get in the way of that. And it breaks down the communication and relationship I can have at that table. And swimming upstream is way harder when you're an Indigenous woman than it would be for a 40-something-year-old man who is of European descent. I have to be prepared for the culturally tone-deaf group in the room because they haven't had the privilege of being educated by Indigenous people on Indigenous issues. They have their settler education that has come with them, and that brings a whole worm can of issues. And we have to recognize, even in this webinar, we're working within colonial structures. We're working in European-based structured systems, and we're expecting to decolonize. That is never going to happen. What I say is, if we want to decolonize anything, whether it's the economy, whether it's our relationships, we're going to have to learn to foster one another and support one another. We're going to have to work on those Indigenous to Indigenous relationships. I really think we have to move more towards talking in a group like that as Indigenous people, working as the Saskatchewan Metis Association and the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, and then the Delee from Northern Saskatchewan. We're all going to have our own perspectives, but as a collective, we have some fundamental beliefs and structures that once we get together, we'll be better equipped to have those real frank conversations with colonized structures and European-based structures, including our economy. We're going to have to work on our relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships. And the only thing I can tell non-Indigenous participants tonight is that if you want to work towards decolonizing the economy, the first thing you're going to have to do is to go to the Indigenous communities around you, or your Indigenous coworkers or Indigenous organizations, and start asking questions and make some relationships there. That is the first step towards decolonizing the economy. For those that are really into learning about this from an academic lens or from a more credible resources, I am a fan of books. You can see I have books here. I have 3 shelves just lining this wall, and they all have different books on them. But I bought this when I was in labor college, and I thought it'd be an interesting read. It's interesting, but it's a little factoidy, but it's Decolonizing Wealth. So maybe that's somewhere else people can start if they want to start, working towards education of what's going on in contemporary society in terms of economics. Decolonizing Employment. This is a great one if you're in labor to start really looking at those issues that come forward in our workplaces. When we have those lovely year plans that have in the past had, let's create a land acknowledgement. Let's start reading this in our workplaces. And then from a women's point of view, I'm really proud of this one. This is Labor in Canada, Cracking Labor's Glass Ceiling. It was published here through a study at the University of Regina. And if we're talking about decolonizing the economy, we need to talk about including those Indigenous voices. And there's one here called Union Women on Turtle Island, A Conversation. And it's with 2 Indigenous female facilitators, sister friends of mine who are working towards making all these changes. I think I'll stop right there, and then we'll move on to the next question so you give other people time to talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dodie. That was extremely rich, and you jumped right into my 2 next questions for you. In fact, you talked about the employment structures that reinforce inequity, and then you talked about strategies for dismantling all of that. So what I'm going to do in the next go around of questions is ask everybody else that, and not skip over you, but save you to the end again, if that's okay. Okay, so we turn to our final speaker, Delee Nikal. Delee is a Wet'suwet'en woman who is part of the Gidimt'en clan, who is an advocate for Indigenous rights and missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. The sovereign Wet'suwet'en nation follows the traditional governance system in unceded territories. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have stated opposition to the Coastal GasLink pipeline project, which has led to reoccupation of several Wet'suwet'en territories. I now turn to Delee to discuss decolonizing. Thank you so much.
Howdy, everybody. Sai Susie Delee. Wet'suwet'en Gidimt'en Kasiak Hasli. My name is Delee Nikal, and I am Wet'suwet'en, part of the Gidimt'en clan. And I guess I spoke with some of the people that had attended the Canadian Labour Congress winter school, just about what was going on in Wet'suwet'en territories. And I think that a really important part of the whole conversation about decolonizing is recognizing that there's, I think, a huge performative, it's performative language, or it's like the concept of decolonizing is performative, I think, because that's insinuating that people, that Indigenous people and their nations have been fully colonized, which is not the case. I see that with the Wet'suwet'en people, especially. We have a very strong hereditary system, a governance system that we follow. And there's, I mean, despite attempts at colonizing and the fact that there are, you know, we work with the colonial system and have worked with the colonial system, I think that I wouldn't say that we are decolonized. So I don't know that it's a matter of decolonizing the economy, but maybe indigenizing the economy. I think that there's a really, as Dodie was saying, there's a really important part about language and what the economy means to a lot of people. So for, you know, the colonial concept of economy does heavily rely on assets and ownership of things. And for Indigenous people, I look at our traditional system, and I think our economy is based upon the worth of our clan members, the worth of our leaders, our tsakaze, which are our women chiefs. It's based upon the amount of respect that you hold with other nations. It's based upon how cared for your territories are. It's based upon the richness and the strength of your knowledge and your stories, your kungach, which is like your song, and your dance that tell the stories. So for us, economy is something completely different. So I think it's really important to recognize that if we're actually going to, if people want to move forward with taking action of decolonizing the economy, people have to really recognize that a lot of the legislation and the colonial laws that were put in place to eradicate, assimilate, and force us to be colonized are still actively in place. I look at the fact that there's an ongoing fight, and it's from, you know, it's from east to west and across imperial imposed borders. I look at the fact that there have been studies done on, you know, or there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report that came out, and, you know, there hasn't been really much action and no real resolution or move toward resolve for that. Reports UNDRIP, EC just passed UNDRIP as legislation, and yet, you know, shortly after raided Wet'suwet'en territories, which are sovereign and unceded. So, you know, we look at the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women final report, and the fact that I think out of 231 calls for justice, there have been approximately 10 that have been filled. And people aren't necessarily really making noise about any of this, or they're not seeing a problem with it. So when people talk about decolonizing anything, like, unless you're actually putting in the work and recognizing that these are, you know, huge injustices that are still occurring, it's all just talk. Unless you're outraged by it, you know, it's performative. And I mean, outraged by everything. Like I said, from east to west, you look at the Mi'kmaq right now are fighting with commercial fishermen and settler fishermen who are insisting that they can't exercise not their treaty rights, but their inherent rights. I think it's really important to recognize that there are inherent rights first and then treaty rights secondary. Inherent rights because we were here, and this is what our ancestors have always done. And when settlers came over, there were agreements made in a lot of cases. There were a lot of treaties drawn up, but there are still those nations are still sovereign nations. They might have drawn up agreements with the colonial government, but that doesn't mean that they, said, okay, 100%. Some people did give up their nation's citizenship. I don't know how, anybody could say that that was done in good faith. There's a lot of coercion that still happens within the government system and trying like that forced assimilation. One of the tactics being by that, the colonial capitalist system being allowed to basically do whatever they want. As I said, the Mi'kmaq with the commercial fishermen and the, look at 1492 Land Back Lane, the Haudenosaunee and the Mohawk people, and the fact that they're fighting again over land, the Haldimand tract, land that was theirs according to part of a treaty and then was signed by an Indian Act band. It's the same thing going on the West Coast. Indian Act imposed councils, band councils, are asked to give up, or give permission for corporations to come and start to take over our lands when we are sovereign nations. And the highest court in Canada has acknowledged our hereditary leaders as the title holders. They've acknowledged, in the Delgamuukw Gisdaywa case, that they're the rightful speakers of the land. So I mean, there are so many, I guess, really, for me, they're really obvious things that are continuing on, the legislation and the inaction of the TRC final report, the MMIWG final report. There's a huge amount of inaction and continued allowance of oppression of Indigenous people and criminalization. That's another huge thing. We look at the actions that occurred with Shut Down Canada and the fact that it wasn't then just Indigenous people that were being criminalized for standing up and saying, no, like the system isn't working for us and we won't allow this to continue. But then settler supporters and settler allies and accomplices standing up with Indigenous people and saying, no, that became, they became criminalized as well. So it's still the colonial government basically stating, like, if you stand up, this is what's going to happen. And it's, you can't have decolonization if those things are still allowed to happen. You can start to transition and recognize that economy is not the same for everybody, and it's certainly not the same, and it hasn't been the same for Indigenous people as it is for or as it's deemed in the colonial structure. So I think maybe the question should be like, how do we indigenize the economy? Where are we putting our value on things? Why aren't we looking at standing up for the exact things that that Indigenous people stand for? Taking care of the land, as Dodie was saying, that's our biggest focus with the Wet'suwet'en people, because we see the effects of climate change. We see, we see the basically the corruption and greed that's ongoing, the colonial capitalist system that is, you know, it's profit for very few people, and it's just not working. And our responsibility in our nation is to ensure that we're taking care of future generations. And it's not about us. We don't actually get to, you know, we don't get to say like, this is going to be beneficial for us, or we can live a comfortable life, or that's not it's not our right. We don't have the right to make decisions on behalf of the future that's not here. And I think that that's the same with a lot of Indigenous people. And in order to find that strength, we need to make sure that there are spaces. So, you know, in order to indigenize the economy, you have to make sure that there are healthy spaces, because you're dealing with, you know, intergenerational trauma, and you're dealing with Indigenous people still facing this oppressive system that was built to, you know, strip away our indigeneity and kill the Indian within the child. So I think that ensuring that we have proper supports and whatnot, and I like, you know, I always say there are a couple of social media pages that I run, and a lot of people ask questions on them, and thankfully enough, a lot of our followers are very supportive. And one of the common things that has come up, although it's great for you to ask questions and go into communities, you have to realize that the onus being put on Indigenous people of educating others, and doing it in such a way that you know, we, in a lot of cases, we have to tiptoe around people and make sure that we don't piss people off so they don't turn and walk away. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that word, but you know, it's a lot of extra weight. Us educating at the same time that we're actually just fighting to stay alive, you know, you have to recognize that additional weight it's heavy, and it's like it can sometimes be the straw that broke the camel's back for people. It's, for myself, you know, I don't necessarily have time to educate. I do, I guess, through the social media platforms, but to like answer questions, and then it becomes personal. And there are so many different, you know, there are so many different educators out there, and there are so many different avenues that people can look at to educate themselves. I know there's a course through the University of Alberta, I believe, that is supposed to be amazing. A lot of people have asked if I've taken it, and I'm too busy living my life and trying to fight being alive, being Indigenous woman. So don't really have time to be taking courses on my own people, but it's, you know, it is really important that people do educate themselves, that they read the difficult materials, that they, you know, learn about the past traumas, but that they also learn about the joys. Because when you view people as, you know, beaten down or, you know, constantly being oppressed, it's sometimes easy to forget for a lot of people that the resilience is the reason that we're here. And the resilience is the reason that we have this very strong, I don't want to say resurgence, because I think it's always been there. I think that it's just being seen more. So we have very strong people. There is a lot of resilience, and, you know, one of those, you have to be able to look, not just reading the TRC final report or the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women final report, but also reading about the joys, seeing the laughter, seeing people as humanizing people in general, and not just lumping somebody in with a nation. It is very individual. So like, yeah, looking beyond the colonial economy and indigenizing your perspective, I guess. Learning more about the people in your area, learning more about the land that you're on and the real history behind it, digging deeper. We have the internet. It's not difficult. When I did speak at the Canadian Association of Labour Lawyers conference, somebody said, how do I learn who the leaders are for a specific nation, or how do I say the nation's name? And I said, well, a lot of Indigenous people that I know have taken to this newfound way of tracking things like that, and it's called Google. So, which is, I mean, a lot of people don't use just common sense in it. And I know that it is very, you know, speaking about indigeneity and decoloniality, it can be a touchy subject and people don't want to go wrong, but we also understand that people are human, and there's, you know, relearning an entire, you know, relearning about Indigenous people and relearning, you know, or re-educating yourself on what the truth is hard work, and it's not going to happen probably in a generation. You know, it just as the attempt to to colonize us hasn't happened in just one generation. It's been ongoing. So I think taking a look at what the economy means, and making sure that we recognize that this isn't, you know, you have to look past things like the imperial imposed borders. You have to look past that means like provincial lines, and you have to recognize that Indigenous people are fighting this all over, fighting forced colonization and the forced reliance on the colonial economy. And that's happening by, you know, projects taking away our land, such as Coastal GasLink, putting us in huge jeopardy, overfishing. You know, we have super low salmon stocks. We look at the amount of lobster that commercial fishermen in Mi'kma'ki, you know, take in as compared to the Mi'kmaq fishermen. You know, forcing people onto small areas of land and allowing developers to sell off huge developments, or looking to put in more of a golf course, as we saw in Oka. You know, it's just our economy is what we're fighting for right now. Our economy is what every single Indigenous nation that's standing up on the front lines, our economy is what we're fighting for. We're fighting to maintain who we are, and we're fighting to maintain the place that we come from. And for us, the place that we come from is the land, and that's our biggest asset. And our strongest people are our matriarchs, they're our Cowessess, and we're fighting to make sure that we protect them in the case of, you know, industrial projects moving in, because we do see higher rates of violence. So our economy is our women, our land, our songs, our tradition, our foods, our waters. And so that's why it's incredibly important to support frontline movements if you're talking about decolonizing the so-called economy, for me. And I just want to touch on the fact, the inaction with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report, and me saying, like, one of our greatest assets and one of our most valuable people are often our women. The reason that really strikes home for me, because in my territories, I can't even say in my territories, in my family, I live in a section where there is, we have a stretch of highway called the Highway of Tears, and Wet'suwet'en territory encompasses a large portion of that. And we've had, like, my cousin Cecilia went missing when I was 10, my cousin Delphine went missing when I was 11, my friend Ramona that I went to camp with and played baseball with went missing when I was 16 and was found murdered. My foster sister Danielle went missing when I was 25 and was reported to be murdered. My cousin Frances went missing 3 years ago. A young woman named Jessica Patrick went missing a year and a half ago and was found murdered. A neighboring nation woman, Cindy Martin, went missing about 2 years ago as well. So, I mean, we look at the fact that there is the allowance of inaction when it comes to the calls for justice. They're basically saying that our economy, or what we base worth on within our nations, are women. means nothing to them. So I think that making very important calls, linking all of that together and making sure that we focus on Indigenous issues as a whole and not just consider them Indigenous issues. Missing and murdered Indigenous women is a human rights issue. It's not just an Indigenous women's issue. It's not just a women's issue. Everybody has women in their lives. Somebody had to have given birth to you. So it's a human rights issue. And I think making sure that we look at that and focus on the bigger picture, and then, you know, hold the colonial governments accountable. I think that's really important. So I think I probably got off track, but yeah.
Thank you, Delee. I don't think you got off track at all. I think you addressed the larger question, and then you gave us a number of strategies and ways in which to indigenize spaces, education systems, economies. I'd like to call upon Lindsay to discuss some of her work and her strategies that she's been involved with, in particular with the decent work movement and in relation to urban Indigenous communities and how these can fit into strategies and structures to indigenize the economy.
Yeah, I'll add to both of my colleagues who just presented. Very, very well said. Just wanted to acknowledge you both. So I work in an urban space in Toronto, and here in Toronto, Indigenous social serving organizations and other institutions that have Indigenous files tend to be the biggest sort of employer of Indigenous folks in the city. So what's also interesting is that in the nonprofit sector, in the context of Indigenous-led organizations versus non-Indigenous-led, we make up probably 1% of the funding. So when we look at analyzing grants that are issued in a space like Toronto, which is very richly diverse across the board, I think we, once representing 100% of the population, now represent, some estimate it to be at around 3%. So it's quite low. We really do sort of, I think, fall behind on the funding scale, which can impede concepts of living on a decent wage, for instance. So some of the past research work that TASC has undertaken under the former leadership of Crystal Bassey and Chantal Maroux, they conducted a really important project that was funded by Atkinson Foundation called Accessing Decent Work, Indigenous Service, Social Service Perspectives. That's this document here. You can locate this document if you're interested in checking it out on our website at TASC, TASSC.ca. I mean, without reading this report, I think having worked most of my career in Indigenous organizations, I would say that there are really unique considerations when working for an Indigenous shop. And when you're receiving, sort of a smaller share of the funding, yet the needs are substantially different than working in a mainstream shop, I think we have a long way to go to create an equitable workforce within the context of decent work movement for Indigenous folks, and particular women who make up a great number of the nonprofit's social serving workforce. I worked for one agency at one point that had a total of something like 77 staff, and 10 of those staff were male identified. And the other remaining folks were women and Two-Spirit folks. So I think we do have a long way to go to recognize the weight that the women carry in the context of the work that I do. We do have a long way to go to recognize that there are, like I said earlier, some sort of unique considerations. So for instance, we talked earlier, one of my colleagues mentioned intergenerational trauma. Some workspaces should have on-site elders or should have access to medicines and culture. Those are additional costs that are not factored in by way of other governments or foundations or other funders typically. They're not something you can build into a budget line item. It's not typically recognized as commonplace with respect to the types of funding asks you might seek out. We're often under-resourced as far as human resources go. Many of our organizations don't have, robust human resources departments. Our governance structures in the nonprofit sector are very interesting. I think we try very hard to maintain concepts of consensus-based governance structures, yet we're balancing that with sort of Carver board models, which is also interesting. We really do have a long way to go to sort of, I guess, include, notions of decent wages, notions of decent work, notions of including culture within the workspace. And then I think too, also when you leave the workspace, very quickly, I worked for a government once for about 5 minutes as an Indigenous representative in a very sort of bureaucratic apparatus, if you will, to work on an Indigenous file. And there are some significant limitations when you are the lone Indigenous person who might be working in a very Western structure. So if you work for corporate or you work for government or something that's not Indigenous-led in nature, you might find yourself sort of out of your element and really needing to sort of assimilate into the culture of that entity, which can be challenging because, to earlier points also made, there are inherent rights to what it means to be Indigenous. There are some unique identity factors that are very individual in nature, and sort of coming into the work, and I can't speak for others, but coming into the work that I do, you don't just come into it as, my name is Lindsay, here's my resume, these are the skills, this is my education. I'm coming in with, my familial history. I'm coming in with, my nationhood. I'm coming in with those teachings that I received from those that I grew up around and with and sort of had interactions with throughout my lifetime. I'm carrying in with me more than just sort of what you'll see on a piece of paper in terms of a modern concept of resume. So the other thing I think our report demonstrates is the significance of lived experience. We need to shift the way that we think. Even, in modern times, I see resumes now where people have like their photograph and a couple of words. And I think that's great. That's a great movement towards sort of moving away from that conventional resume structure. You want to be able to hire people, then we have to look to that lived experience that I think folks bring to the table that does have value, that does hold meaning, and those things that necessarily won't be captured through a training or formal education program or academia or whatever we do as a society to recognize people for their achievements. I'm taught that you would recognize people for some of their natural gifts and talents. And in fact, as a leader of people and in manager roles in my work, there's, the first question I often ask a new team is, what are your gifts? I'm less concerned about what you did, what you accomplished. What are your gifts? What are those natural things that you're born with? What makes you who you are? And how do we do that work together in such a way that we capitalize on those strengths and natural gifts of people? The need for more cultural supports, like I said, the need for more resources, just to sort of recap, and the need to recognize that Indigenous folks do need safety when working outside of their own communities. Noah.
Thank you, Lindsay. Tamzin, I'll now turn to you to speak to some of your work and how you can offer some strategies, in particular with from a Métis women's perspective to aid the economy in indigenizing.
Absolutely. So we do have two reports that I will be talking about briefly today. The first of which is our environmental scan. It's called Building a Métis Women's Blueprint. It's available on our website under our reports and toolkit section. And the second of which is our own Métis specific MMIWG report. I think it's important to talk about the blueprint first, just because it sets the stage for, why we approached the MMIWG report in the way that we did. And so the reason why we undertook this blueprint is because there is a huge gap in data when it comes to Métis experiences, particularly the experiences of Métis women, girls, two-spirit and gender diverse folks when accessing social services. So we reached out to social service providers across the Métis homeland. So youth programs, policing, justice, employment, education, friendship centers, a wide range of services And we asked about their data collection methods. Do you track the clients that come in? Do you note if they're Indigenous or not Indigenous? Does Indigenous go further to look at the three groups, you know, status, non-status? Are on-reserve shelters helping Métis clients? What is the lens that you're using to develop your program? Is it Métis inclusive? Often what we found was that there was a lack of understanding about Métis as far as Indigenous in the conversation ago. We help Indigenous and Métis clients. You know, Métis are Indigenous. So that right there presented a huge lack of understanding. And whenever we did ask about the lenses that were used in development, often the responsibility would fall on a staff member. Oh, you know, so-and-so is Métis, and so she looks after that, which one is a huge form of tokenism, excuse me, and also really puts the onus on the individual to have to teach about their culture when really it should be at an institutional level and foundational level. So that was something that we found with the blueprint. We did, of course, find best practices as well, and always being strength-based, we wanted to highlight those as well. But because we need to start at this gap in data and really build our way up, that's kind of the focus that we chose with the blueprint. So I encourage everyone to look at it, to really take away from that, you know, an approach that looks deeper. What are you talking about when you're using the term Indigenous? Is it inclusive of everyone's experiences? How is it built? Who is included at the table? And so that did set the tone in terms of our MMIWG, our Métis specific MMIWG report, which is also available on our website. So to build that report, and it's a part of an ongoing project that we have, we've been hosting a number of engagement sessions across the homeland with service providers, community members, governing members, but this kind of set the stage at the beginning. So we engaged with community members and subject matter experts to write this, and we looked at Métis perspectives when it comes to rights and implementation frameworks, you know, social media and pop culture understandings of Métis women and Indigenous women. And the reason why was because we didn't feel that we were included in the process of the federal government in writing that report. And I say we as a settler on behalf of Métis women, just for transparency's sake. And we didn't feel that their voices were included as well. And so, you know, part of indigenizing the economy or decolonizing, if you want to use that word, decolonizing anything really, you need to look at the partnerships that you have and how you're approaching those partnerships. Because all too often what ends up happening is Indigenous organizations or individuals are asked, you know, here's this report, what do you think? Is your perspective included? When the reality is that's kind of acting as more of a checklist so people can feel better about having checked in with the Indigenous community, when in reality this relationship should have started from the beginning, you know, and had been nurtured throughout. So and for mainstream organizations, what we found especially is this means partnering with Indigenous organizations and giving that space back for them to share their voices. So it's not asking what information that they have and then putting it in your own words, but it's amplifying the work that they're doing and the voices from their own mouths. So all that to say, those two reports are two reports that we're very proud of, that we continually uplift and return to, because it is, you know, it is a living document and something that we need to continually return to and ask ourselves what we're doing and how we can do it better.
Thank you thank you very much for that, Tamzin. I'm just going to out loud check in with Faye and Jan to double check. Are we finishing at 8:30 or are we finishing at 9 Eastern time?
I think our hope was to finish when the speakers felt that they had said everything they needed to say. So if that takes us to 9, that takes us to 9. This is such a huge, fantastic experience. So it depends on the energy of Dodie and Delee and Lindsay and Tamzin. If they're prepared to keep going and have the energy to do so, we'd greatly appreciate it.
And I'll just give Lindsay's regrets. Lindsay had to leave the webinar because she needed to pick up her son. So she apologizes for having to step out early, but obviously that is an important obligation, and she wishes the rest of the webinar good success. So we will continue, but she does send her regrets for the question, period.
Okay. Well, in that case, I mean, I know that we are all really benefiting from this these rich presentations. How about we do a final go around with some final thoughts if our speakers are willing. We'll start with Dodie and then move to Delee and then Tamzin. How does that sound? Great.
Oh.
I'll turn the mic over to Dodie then.
Okay, so so I guess some of the work that I'm doing to help with this whole concept of decolonizing, or as the other panelists have affirmed, indigenizing our relationships outside of our own Indigenous communities. I've done a lot of facilitation for Kairos. I will do blanket exercises, but I don't hold them in the typical Kairos format. The blanket exercise was actually created with the Aboriginal Women's Network, and since it is my culture and my history, I tend to do it slightly different, and I follow our local protocols. I've also done a lot of work on reconciliation in the watershed in the community, and it's talking to people about the importance of accessing, drinkable, potable water for not just for Indigenous communities, but for all people in southern Saskatchewan. Needless to say, we are a landlocked province, but we are very heavy in our mining and oil extraction, resource extraction economy here in the southern prairies. Our mining focuses mostly on potash, and by and large, it's done through solution mining, which is where they bring the muck up in a slurry, and it's a patented slurry that will remove as much potash as possible, and then that slurry is not cleaned up and it's not remediated. It gets pushed back down into the holes that it came from, and so essentially a good portion of southern Saskatchewan is floating on huge lakes of slurry. When they extract, and what they use is, of course, they use fresh water. We also have a very high farming industry here as well, which uses a lot of chemicals to maximize the profit per acre on their high yield crops. So all of those pollutants in the form of, what do they call them, fertilizers, end up in our water table. So I do a lot of conversations about the fact that we really don't understand geographically how our water table works here in southern Saskatchewan, and we have to be really cautious on how much of it we use, because we know it's a definite resource. It does have limitations. Mother Nature has her own lungs to clean the water, our sloughs and our underground aquifers, and we do not know, science doesn't know to any extent what those branches look like, those river branches look like under the ground. So I do a lot of work in my community talking about the importance of having safe and healthy water for all of us and for generations to come. I also work with a group in the city. We call ourselves Matriarchs on Duty, and we actually came about because of MMIWG2S. And we're a bunch of Indigenous women, and I'm just going to read what we've crafted as our definition of who we are. We're a circle of First Nations and matriarchs who action in our inherent rights to intervene when one of our children or generations is in need. So it's something as simple as that. And we work with other community-based organizations as well to help achieve any services that our people need. In particular, right now with COVID, we actually have a COVID emergency response group of 4 who has been consistently and persistently addressing the needs of some of our elders and seniors in the city here who are isolated at home because they may be high risk, because their families might live back on their own nations. So we have adopted, some of us have adopted the role of caring for those seniors and elders. And it's actually branched off and included a group called the Wellness Wheel, which is a group of Indigenous professors, it's led by an Indigenous professor named Dr. Jolisa Sakamoose, who is actually developing a natural medicine chest, and she's doing her own growing, her own harvesting. She's going out onto her nation and learning all about medicine. So those are some things that are happening out on the prairies. The one thing I want to I want to bring up is I shared a couple of pictures with Faye. I think land acknowledgements are a way to start in our organizations, but I find they're becoming rote. I find that people, when we do the land acknowledgements in our meetings, they're not actively listening. They're on their phones, or they're on their tablets, or they're on their laptops, and it's just become another one of those steps in the function of our rules of order for our meetings. And as an Indigenous woman around the table, I was finding that quite offensive. So
would you like me to show the pictures?
Yes. So what I did is I was asked to do the land acknowledgement for the last meeting for the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour Executive Council. I'm a member there. And so they sent me the land acknowledgement, and if you could share that unedited version, this is what they gave me.
Hang on a second, I will just share.
And you know, it's pretty much standard format. You're going to see something that probably is very similarly read around your tables. You know, we begin this meeting by acknowledging blah 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 blah. You know, and no one really pays attention anymore, I'm finding. So I thought, you know, this time if I'm going to be doing this land acknowledgement, which I have rejected doing in the past because I find them very much becoming more tokenism, I decided I was going to personalize this one, and so I took it upon myself to do it. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't get it edited beforehand. And for me, that was reclaiming part of my nationhood at that colonial table, was letting them know, hey, when I do this land acknowledgement, you better listen, because it's not going to be what was put in your packages. So if you could share the next slide. So you can see slight and subtle differences, like something like in the second paragraph where we talk about the Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Nakota, Dene, Saulteaux. I've actually changed the name to the name of the nations, right? I speak from a first person point of view because I'm an Indigenous person at that table, and I want them to know that land acknowledgement means something to me when I read it out to them. And then instead of just keeping it basic, here, like I've said in the past in this panel, was that it is the Treaty 4 was signed here in Fort Qu'Appelle. Well, we actually had our Treaty 4 celebration. September 15th to 25th was the date of the signing. We actually have a gathering there, Treaty 4 gathering at Fort Qu'Appelle every year to celebrate the spirit and the intent of Treaty 4 document from the Indigenous side. And I also talked a bit about reconciliation and how it must be meaningful, but we need to learn the truths of things first. And that's very much what we're talking about in this panel. And like you've noticed before, I throw books around a lot, and I gave them suggested readings. At the very bottom there is the phonetical way of saying thank you, which is right at the very, at the very end of that form was my writing. And it's letting them know in my own language, that I'm thankful that you're here, that you listen to me. So, those small things that we do as Indigenous women around those tables, these little small things can have a very significant difference. I want us to go beyond and challenge colonial organizations to go beyond these check boxes of the land acknowledgement. I was telling Faye yesterday, I find that land acknowledgements are part of that year-long work plan that every corporation does. Let's do our big goals for the year, and let's see what we can achieve, because all of our bonuses are based on those goals. Land acknowledgement, let's put it on, great work plan. Let's do, check, great, everyone's doing it. Congratulations, everyone. No, we need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond the standard acceptable indigenization of our work cultures. Because our youth are going to expect it. I've mentioned before, we're healing, our communities are healing, our people are healing, we're reclaiming, and we're affirming who we are in our nationhood. Our youth are becoming so healthy. I see my cousins and my nephews and my nieces and my children so much more confident in who they are, that they're artists, they're dancers, they're drummers, they're singers, they're starting to speak the language again. Our organizations and our economy needs to figure out how to include indigenization into their structures, because our children are not going to ask for it. We're talking about youth, specifically in Saskatchewan. The Indigenous population under 25 is the fastest and largest growing demographic, and they're the healthiest. They're not going to be asking for this in 5 years. They're going to demand it. And we're seeing it in social justice capacities already. We're seeing our students and our youth say, no, thank you. to student services at University of Regina. We're going to make our own Indigenous services in Regina. And if you're not at the university, and if you're not going to help us, well, guess what? We're going to become loud and vocal about it, and we're going to create it, and we're going to make this beautiful. And we really wish you could come on board. Our organizations and institutions are going to have to do that as well. A perfect example, and Delee, I'm really glad you brought it up, was the fishery situation in Mi'kmaq territory. Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Grand Chief Derek Mi'kmaq, his response to that struggle that they're facing in the Atlantic territories is that we don't need to worry about what colonial economics are going to do to our Indigenous fisheries rights. We need to develop territorial economic relationships so that we're buying the lobsters from those Indigenous fishermen. We don't need to worry about other fishermen who are settler folk being subjected to harassment and violence because they're buying from Indigenous fisheries. We will support them, and we need to build those structures. Those are the things that are going to happen in this society. And decolonizing Canada needs to happen because we've always been here. So, you know, join us. Another great, if you want to talk more about indigenizing economy, Land Back in Action in that Briar Patch issue I gave you. There are four suggested ways of decolonizing economically. Paying rent is being done in the States to Indigenous territories. Their renters are paying a percentage to the territory, the Indigenous people in the territory they're in. Creation of land trusts and taxation for people on Indigenous territories. Permitting, like the lobster fishermen, the Mi'kmaq lobster fishermen, and housing. We need to make sure that we talk about housing, affordable, accessible, and meaningful housing for Indigenous people, whether they're on a nation or off a nation. If you have a home, you have a future. If you have a future, you have security. If you have security, you have stability. And that's what makes us stronger and powerful and will bring us to a level that our non-Indigenous peers see us as our equal.
Thank you so much, Dodie. Tamzin, I'm going to turn to you for some final words.
Thank you. Thank you. No, thank you so much to everyone just for sharing your wisdom and your experiences and your thoughts today. I've learned so much this evening, and I'm so excited to take this forward. So endless amounts of thank you. I want to stress the importance of these strength-based narratives that I think each of the panelists have spoken about tonight when we frame these conversations. You know, we're not rescuing Indigenous people. They don't need rescuing. There needs to be acknowledgement that there's always been strength and resilience, and even through colonialism and the atrocities that it's brought and continues to bring, there's been strength and resilience and knowledge, and it's continually there. And so we need to look at who's at these decision-making tables. We need to see the gaps, we need to fill them, and we need to fill them in appropriate ways. Dodie spoke about personal biases, and I think that's really where it starts. We need to change at the individual level. You know, one of the buzzwords that we hear these days is gender-based analysis, GBA. But again, we need to take that further. We need to make that culturally relevant. As a side piece, we do have a tool on our website if you're curious about what that means from a Métis perspective. But yes, we need to look at policy and programs and ensure that they're inclusive down to the individual level. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamzin. And last but not least, let's end with Delee with some final thoughts.
Okay, I think just some of the steps that people can take, aside from educating yourself and indigenizing your education and being able to see humanizing Indigenous people and knowing the territories that you're on, is also recognizing that we're asking for systemic change within a system that was built to eradicate us. So I think that if we look at the possibility of changing legislation and changing, like utilizing that system to indigenize, you know, the economy or indigenize our education and our knowledge, that it's going to take a very long time. So, or maybe won't happen at all. I mean, it's a colonial capitalist system built upon patriarchy. So it's it would definitely be very difficult for us to be realistic and say that that's going to be, that things are going to change very soon. So I think going out and standing with people or contributing in whichever way you can, whether it's, you know, we ask people with Wet'suwet'en, support in different ways is, again, it's not just monetary support that people on front lines movements are looking for. So, you know, indigenizing or decolonizing the economy means protecting our lands and our women. And for the most part, you look at all of the frontlines movements, frontlines Indigenous movements that are happening, and it's a huge amount of women. I don't want to say it's primarily women, but it's primarily women standing on the front lines. So, I mean, if the most vulnerable portion of society can be out there facing, you know, I'm out in the territories and there are cops and private security and industry workers, you know, police pulling us over, not necessarily me, because I think they just kind of try and avoid me, but, you know, pulling people over for absolutely no reason. If people can put themselves, like Indigenous women can put themselves in those positions, I think that people that are in more comfortable and privileged positions can do the same. And at the very least, you know, be prepared to get a little uncomfortable. You're going to have to be okay with it, because otherwise, if you sit in a place of complacency and comfort and you allow the system to continue as it is, and you say, oh, we're going to do it through this systemic change, this like changing of legislation, it's not realistic. You're allowing for the continued violence of Indigenous women and Indigenous cultures. And it is an uncomfortable truth, and it turns a lot of people off. But at the same time, I mean, we don't really have the time to mince words anymore. Our economy as Wet'suwet'en people, our land and our landmarks, the land where our ancestors lie in the Queese Trail, have been destroyed. Our culturally modified trees have been destroyed. Our women are put at higher risk on a daily basis because of the people that are out there, the transient workers that are out there. Our water that sustains us, you know, our water that provides everything for us is being put at risk. So we don't really have the time to sit around and wait for legislation to change. That being said, there is a court case that's going on. I mean, I think that we can sit and we can, you know, hope that change is going to come in the time that it needs to, but realistically, I look at what's going on, you know, south of the imperial imposed border, and Black and Indigenous people, we're seeing, you know, extremely high rates of us losing our lives. And you read the reports, I'm pretty sure nothing's being done about it. So it's time for people to stand up. I'm not saying like engage in the revolution, but if you want to, it's probably, you know, going to be really well received. Standing on the front lines, contributing however you can, supporting people, even emotional support. There is, you know, a lot of emotional labor that goes into being on the front lines and standing up for you know, Black and Indigenous people and Afro-Indigenous people, and standing up against the colonial capitalist system. It's really emotionally draining. And for, you know, some, you know, I'm off on stress leave. You know, it's a lot. And I think that, that just emotional support, people reaching out to people in movements in your area is really important. Financial support is definitely welcome, but I mean, it's COVID times. There's no expectation of that. Support by researching and sharing information with each other so that we don't have to do that work as well is really important. interacting in the colonial system for sure. But I think making sure that you support frontlines movements is incredibly important right about now. And making sure that you educate each other and yourselves as to what's really going on. And getting it, hearing it, like, you know, everybody said earlier, hearing it from Indigenous voices, amplifying Indigenous voices, I think is incredibly important, which is why I'm so incredibly grateful, Masaikiao, for having me speak and letting me ramble on for a little bit. So I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hopefully all the people that see this, you know, maybe being a part of the revolution. That'd be great. Masai.
Thank you so, so much. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Lindsay, Tamzin, Dodie, Delee. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Merci à nos présentatrices, Lindsay, Tamzin, Dodie, et Delee. I wish you all great courage in our collective action and amidst the pandemic. Je vous souhaite bon courage à tout le monde. And I now turn back over to Jan and Faye for closing remarks.
Okay, thank you so much, Delee, Dodie, Tamzin, Lindsay, Sheetal, for such a rich conversation, such rich learnings that we will absolutely incorporate into what we will be doing next. And so with that, I just want to share my screen one last time as you patiently watch me fiddle with this. I do want to tell you about our next webinar. What we heard on our last gathering together, we had hoped to have our presentations and then divide into smaller breakout rooms to have interactive conversations with each other. And we heard that apart from the fact that we ran out of time, people were absorbing so much rich information that they wanted to have a bit of time to digest it before we had a conversation. And so what we've done with our schedule is we've added 2 additional webinars, which will be devoted exclusively to strategic conversations with each other about the issues that we've been learning about on the last webinars. So we will circulate a discussion paper that pulls together a number of the threads, our recordings and supporting documents and things that our speakers have referred to will be posted on our website. But our first strategic conversation is happening on Wednesday, October 14th at 7 o'clock. And we will, for all of our discussions, have live interpretation and closed captioning available. And then we have a series of other webinars coming up. On the 21st of October, we will be looking at anti-oppression and the green economy. On November 4th, we'll be looking at integrating the fundamental principles of a feminist economy. Then on November 18th, we'll have our second strategic conversation date. On November 25th, we will have a session where we'll have a keynote speaker on mobilizing, and then we will break out into groups around planning collaborative actions. And then on Monday, December 7th, we will have our public action on the 50th anniversary of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, so that we can launch our manifesto, as it were, our demands for updating a real plan for what will ensure we have a just economy for all that leaves no one behind. So we'll be putting up the registration links for all of those, but please make sure you have the dates on your calendar. If you want to get in touch with us, we have our contact information on the slides, which will also be posted on our website. Jan, I'll hand it over to you for last comments.
Well, I'll just simply say, because it is getting late, huge thank you to everyone, to everybody that's attended this session, this fantastic, rich conversation, and really a guide for so many of us as settlers to better learnings and on indigenizing the economy. So thanks to the attendees, but particularly thank you to Delee and Dodie and Tamzin, and obviously Lindsay, for sharing your wisdom with us. So we thank you. And we'll see everybody October 14th.